The morning came pale and slow, spilling over the plains like milk poured too gently. Mist still clung to the barn roofs. The cattle stood silent, steam rising from their bodies. From inside the shed, a faint rustle, the sound of a woman remembering she was alive. She woke to the smell of hay and dust. Her hands ached, her lips were cracked. The blanket the little girl had given her was still wrapped around her shoulders, heavy with kindness. Through a thin crack in the wall, she saw the sky bleeding orange and rose. A rooster crowed. The day began again, indifferent, endless. Outside, Thomas Weller was already working, his boots deep in mud, hammer echoing against the boards. He didn't look toward the shed. Maybe he didn't want to see what mercy looked like in daylight. The woman, Ayanna, though none yet knew her name, stepped out quietly, bare feet brushing the frost-bitten grass. Her head was bowed low, as if afraid her shadow might offend the earth. Earl, the ranch hand, spotted her and spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Well, I'll be damned. She's still breathing." Thomas didn't answer. He just kept hammering. Ayanna walked toward the trough, knelt, and washed her face in the cold water. The shock of it cut through her fog. When she lifted her head, she saw her reflection, gaunt, eyes hollow but fierce. She did not look like the girl who once sang beside the fire. She looked like the echo of someone braver. By mid-morning, she had begun to work. No one asked her to. No one told her not to either. She cleaned the stables, carried water, brushed down the horses. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, like prayer. The men watched from afar, muttering. "She's got spirit," one said. "Spirit, don't make her clean," another replied. But Thomas said nothing. He only noticed how the animals seemed calmer around her. The horse that usually kicked and snorted near strangers stood still when she passed. Even the barn cats rubbed against her legs. He told himself it meant nothing. Some folks just had a touch with beasts. Still, something in him stirred. Something he'd buried with his wife. At noon, the child appeared again. Annie Weller, 6 years old, with freckles scattered like stars across her cheeks. She carried a biscuit wrapped in a napkin. She crept toward the woman, glancing over her shoulder to make sure her father didn't see. Ayanna noticed her, paused her work, and waited. The girl held out the biscuit. "It's honey bread," she said softly. "Papa says I shouldn't waste food, but you look hungry." Ayanna blinked, unsure if she understood every word. She hesitated, then accepted it with both hands, bowing her head slightly. The girl grinned. "You can have it." Ayanna smiled faintly. Her lips trembled. "Thank you." The words came out broken, but full of heart. Annie sat beside her in the straw. They didn't share a language, but somehow they shared everything else. Ayanna showed her how to weave a strand of grass into a tiny braid. The girl giggled when it fell apart, and Ayanna laughed softly, a sound that startled even herself. It had been so long since she had heard her own laughter that she almost didn't recognize it. The narrator whispers, "Children see what grown men have forgotten, that souls are mirrors, not borders." Thomas watched from the porch, his hammer still in his hand, forgotten midair. He told himself he was only making sure the stranger wasn't up to trouble. But what he saw disarmed him, his daughter laughing, the native woman smiling through exhaustion. He turned away quickly, throat tight. He hadn't heard that laugh in years, not since Mary. Inside the house, he sat by the table, staring at the wooden cross that hung above the window. The preacher had told him once that mercy was godly, but he also said not to trust their kind. He wondered which part of the preacher's words the Lord actually meant. Days passed like that, quietly, gently. Ayanna worked, never asking for more than food and a place to sleep. She learned a few English words from Annie: water, fire, home. Annie learned a few of hers, to hazo, nilchi. The words sounded like wind and river and peace. Thomas began to leave small signs of acceptance. A cup of milk left by the shed, a folded shawl near her bed. He never spoke of it, and she never thanked him aloud, but she felt it, the slow thaw of suspicion. The ranch, once heavy with silence, began to breathe again. Annie sang more. The cattle grew calmer. Even the wind seemed softer, as though the land itself approved of this strange new family. Yet peace in those parts was a fragile thing. One evening, as the sky bruised into purple and firelight flickered through the windows, a rider came up the path. It was the preacher from town, Reverend Clay. He was a lean man with eyes like nails, sharp, cold, and certain. Thomas greeted him on the porch. "Evenin', Reverend." "Evenin', Tom," Clay said, dismounting. His gaze slid past Thomas to the shed, where the faint figure of Ayanna was visible, tending the fire pit. "Word around town says you've taken in one of them." Thomas stiffened. "She needed help." "Help leads to sin, my friend," Clay replied. "You know what they did to your people. You know how their kind repays kindness." Thomas's jaw clenched. "She's just working. Ain't no harm in that." The preacher sighed, his tone heavy with condescension. "You let her near your child, and you'll see harm soon enough." Thomas said nothing. The preacher tipped his hat and left a pamphlet on the porch, a sermon about purity and the dangers of heathens. When his horse's hooves faded into the night, Thomas picked up the paper and fed it to the fire. He stood there for a long time, watching the flames consume the words. Inside, Annie was braiding a strand of Ayanna's hair. The two of them sat close, humming a soft tune that neither fully understood. That night, the wind howled over the plains. Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, looking out at the shed, watching the dim light flicker through the cracks. He thought of Mary, of her hands, her laughter, her gentle ways. How she used to say, "The world's only cruel when we let it be." He took a deep breath, then another. He was not sure if he believed in God anymore, but he believed in his daughter's laughter, and in the way the land seemed quieter since the woman came. The next morning, he brought her a basket of apples. He didn't speak, just set it down near her and walked away. Ayanna watched him go, confusion in her eyes, gratitude in her silence. She picked up an apple, held it to her heart, and whispered something in her own tongue, a word the wind seemed to carry away gently. "Toda, thank you." Time passed. Weeks melted into each other, soft as candle wax. Winter crept in, and the first frost bit at the edges of the land. The ranch began to feel less like a stranger's house and more like a heartbeat. One evening, Annie drew a picture in the dirt with a stick, a small house, 3 figures holding hands. She pointed to each one. "Papamu." Ayanna looked at it for a long moment. Her eyes glistened. Then she added one more line in the dirt, a river flowing beside the little house. She smiled. The morning began with the kind of silence that feels older than sound. The river moved like a long silver ribbon across the land, slow and tired, carrying the night's chill upon its back. Mist hung low, curling around the cottonwoods, blurring the edge between earth and sky. And then a figure rose from the water. She came as though born of the current itself. A woman, wrapped in rags and trembling, her dark hair clinging to her face like strands of wet ink. Her skin shone pale under the dawn light, marked with bruises, streaked with mud. In her hands, she held something small, a pouch woven tight from reeds and feathers, pressed close to her heart. The river dripped from her body like tears that refused to stop. She looked back once, over her shoulder, toward the direction she had come. The horizon was empty, but her fear was not. The Wild West was not kind to women like her. It was not kind to women at all. They said the land was free, open for any man brave enough to claim it. But to her people, the land had never needed claiming. It was already alive, already sacred. Now it lay wounded, fenced, plowed, traded. And she, too, was one of its scars. She walked barefoot across the cold mud, each step uncertain, her breath breaking into soft clouds. The wind smelled of pine and horses. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck wood, the sound of civilization building its cages. She had walked for 3 days since escaping the soldiers' camp. 3 days of hiding from men, from dogs, from her own reflection in the water. Her name was once Ayanna, though she had not spoken it aloud since her capture. The men who had burned her village had taken more than bodies. They had taken names, language, dignity. She had survived, yes, but survival is not always life. Sometimes it is only breath refusing to die. The river had been her only witness. Now, As the sun lifted, bleeding gold across the plains, she saw a shape in the distance. A ranch, small and tired, fences reaching out like weary arms. Smoke rose from a chimney. She hesitated. The last time she approached white men's homes, there had been shouting and fire. But hunger gnawed at her ribs, and shame whispered that she was no longer worth hiding. She moved forward. The ranch belonged to Thomas Weller, a man carved from the same dust his land was made of. His hands were cracked, his face weathered like dry bark. He'd built that ranch with his wife, a woman named Mary who had laughed like spring rain. But laughter had left the house 6 years ago, the day childbirth took her away and left him with a daughter too small to remember her smile. The man saw movement near the fence and squinted against the light. He set down his tools, reached for the rifle that leaned by the post. The figure moved closer, slow, hesitant. A woman, barefoot, dirty. His grip tightened. She raised a trembling hand, not to beg, but to show she was unarmed. Thomas Weller was not cruel by nature, but grief hardens men in strange ways. He saw not a woman, but a stranger, a reminder of wars fought in the same valleys, of raids and revenge. His jaw clenched. He shouted, voice echoing across the yard. "You best turn around, miss. Ain't nothing for you here." She didn't move. Her lips parted, trying to form words, but her English was broken, swallowed by years of silence. "Please," she whispered finally, voice cracking. Her eyes glistened, not pleading, just human. Thomas lifted the rifle higher, then froze. A small voice broke through the tension, light as a bird. "Papa!" From the porch, a little girl appeared, no more than 6. She held a wooden doll, missing an arm. Her blonde hair shone like corn silk in the morning sun. Thomas turned, startled. The girl's eyes were wide, staring at the woman by the fence. "Papa," she asked softly, "is she my new mama?" The world seemed to stop. Even the river went quiet in that moment. Thomas's throat tightened. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The woman lowered her gaze, her face flushing with a shame she didn't earn. The child's question lingered in the air, innocent, untainted by history or hatred. Thomas finally lowered his rifle. He muttered under his breath, "Go inside, Annie." But the girl didn't move. She tilted her head, curiosity lighting her face. Then, seeing the woman shiver, she stepped down from the porch and ran back inside. A moment later, she returned, clutching a wool blanket in her tiny hands. She walked right up to the fence, pushed the blanket through the rails, and smiled. The woman took it, slowly, reverently, as if accepting an offering from heaven itself. Thomas watched, his heart caught somewhere between anger and sorrow. By midday, the woman had collapsed near the stable. Her body had given up before her will did. Thomas sighed, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and called for one of his ranch hands. "Earl." "Get her some water," he said. "And bread." "Not much." Earl spat in the dirt. "Boss, you sure?" "She's one of them." Thomas cut him off with a stare sharp enough to slice air. "I said, get her water." The woman didn't hear their words. She was half-conscious, drifting between fever and memory. In her mind, she saw her mother's face, painted in ochre and sunlight, teaching her how to weave the same little pouch she now clutched. Inside were dried sage leaves, a small carved bone, and a lock of her brother's hair. All she had left of home. When water touched her lips, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open to find the child again, kneeling beside her, watching with concern. The girl smiled shyly. "I'm Annie." The woman tried to smile back, but only tears came. The narrator's voice settles like dusk. Sometimes mercy is not born of love, but of the ghost of what love used to be. As night fell, the prairie turned blue and silent. Coyotes called from afar. The ranch lamps flickered against the wind. Inside the small shed behind the stable, the woman lay wrapped in the wool blanket, her breath shallow but steady. She could hear faint laughter, the child's, from the house. It reminded her of the river, the way it had once sounded before men built bridges over it. She whispered her name under her breath, barely a sound. Ayanna. It was not a prayer. It was remembrance, a thread tying her to the person she had been before the world decided otherwise. Outside, Thomas stood by the porch, looking out toward the shed. The child had fallen asleep, curled under his arm. The stars were bright, so bright it hurt to look at them. He told himself he took the woman in because he pitied her. But pity was only the shadow of something deeper, something he was not ready to name. The wind moved through the wheat, whispering softly, as if the land itself approved. And so, the river woman slept, not safely, but alive, under a stranger's roof, watched over by the same stars that once lit her mother's sky. The Wild West had many stories of gunmen, of gold, of greed. But few remembered the quiet ones. The ones that began not with gunfire, but with kindness too small to notice. Yet those were the stories that saved the world, one soul at a time. Annie tilted her head. River, Iona nodded. She touched the child's heart, then the river she drawn, then her own heart. Annie understood, somehow. Her face lit up with wonder. The narrator's voice hummed softly, like an old song fading into the dusk. Sometimes the heart heals not through words, but through work, through small gestures that speak louder than forgiveness. But peace in the Wild West was always temporary, a quiet before thunder. Whispers had already begun to spread through town, that Thomas Weller had gone soft, that a savage woman was living under his roof. The same men who'd once nodded at him in respect now avoided his eyes. At the saloon, they muttered into their whiskey, "Ain't right. What he's doing," letting one of them, heathens, near his little girl. The storm was gathering, and though Thomas didn't yet know it, the choices he made in the days to come would test the last of his humanity. For now, though, the ranch still slept under starlight. The river still whispered beyond the hills, and in the small shed behind the barn, the woman once called Iona smiled in her sleep, her first true smile in years. The night carried it gently, like a promise. The days turned brittle and thin. Frost bit at the fences. The grass bent low under the weight of morning ice. Winter had come to the valley, and with it, whispers carried on the cold wind. At the small town's edge, men talked low and mean inside the saloon. They spoke of Thomas Weller's shame, of a red-skinned woman sleeping on his land, of sin crawling beneath his roof. They drank courage from their glasses and spat poison between their words. The preacher had spoken again last Sunday, his voice rising like thunder over the congregation. The serpent hides in charity. The devil wears the face of pity. And though he never named names, everyone knew who he meant. The West was wide, but hearts were narrow in those parts. Back on the ranch, the world moved slower. Iona still rose with the dawn, still fed the animals, still hummed her soft songs by the river. The child, Annie, followed her everywhere now, like sunlight following warmth. They spoke in pieces of both languages. "Good day," the girl would say. Iona would nod. "Good day." Sometimes they laughed without needing words at all. Thomas watched from afar. He was quieter these days. His work got done, his hands stayed busy, but something heavy stirred inside him. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something rawer, harder to name. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. That pain could make saints of the strangest people. But peace is a way of making men jealous. One evening, a rider arrived again. Earl, the ranch hand, his face red with whiskey and self-righteousness. He slammed the barn door open. "Boss," he started, "you best listen. The boys in town are saying things. They're saying you lost your senses." Thomas didn't look up from his work. Let him talk. Earl's eyes flicked toward Iona, who was sweeping the stable floor in silence. "She don't belong here. You're a skin for trouble." Thomas straightened, his shadow long and dark against the lamplight. "I said let him talk." Earl spat, his voice rising. "You think you're better than us? She's got you bewitched, that's what it is. You let your wife's ghost rot while you play family with a savage." The crack of Thomas's hand silenced him. Earl stumbled back, a mix of shock and fury on his face. Thomas's voice came low, shaking. "You watch your tongue. You talk about my wife, you best be ready to join her." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Earl turned, muttering curses, and rode off into the night. Iona had watched the whole thing, broom still in her hands. When Thomas turned toward her, she looked down quickly. He saw shame flicker across her face, shame for his anger, his defense of her. He said softly, almost to himself, "You did not deserve this world, woman." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She bowed her head in gratitude anyway. The next week brought sickness. Annie fell ill, fever burning through her small body, her skin hot as desert sand. The doctor was 2 towns away. The snow made travel near impossible. Thomas sat beside her bed, helpless, guilt eating at his chest. Ayanna entered quietly, a bowl of water in her hands. Thomas looked up sharply. "She needs medicine, not." But Ayanna knelt beside the girl and dipped a cloth into the water, laying it gently across her forehead. Then she began to hum, the same low, haunting melody she often sang by the river. Thomas wanted to protest, but the sound stopped him. It was a lullaby, not one he knew, but it felt older than grief itself. The kind of song that had once been sung to the earth before fences divided it. Annie's breathing eased, her small hands unclenched. Through the long night, Ayanna stayed by her side, feeding her water, wiping her brow, whispering words the wind itself seemed to understand. By dawn, the fever broke. The child slept, cheeks flushed with life again. Thomas stood in the doorway, his eyes red from sleeplessness. He wanted to speak, to thank her, but his voice failed him, so he just nodded once, deeply. Ayanna nodded back. In that silence, something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not romance, something purer. Recognition. But peace does not last long in places built on pride. A few nights later, under a swollen moon, horses thundered down the hill. For riders, drunk, angry, hearts full of fire and fear. Their torches lit the sky with gold and smoke. Earl was among them. He shouted, "Come out, Weller. You think you're better than us? Let's see how holy you look when your house burns." Thomas came out, rifle in hand, boots crunching the frost. "Turn around, Earl. Go home." The others laughed, sharp, cruel. "Not till she's gone," one said, spitting into the dirt. "Ain't right what you're doing, keeping that redwitch here." Thomas's jaw locked. "You touch this ranch, I'll put you in the ground." The woman appeared behind him, silent as a shadow. Her eyes reflected the firelight. Not fear, but something older, steadier. She stepped forward, standing beside Thomas. The men jeered. "Look at that. He's trained her like a dog." Earl dismounted, torch in hand, swaggering closer. "Go on, Tom. Step aside. We'll take care of this." Thomas raised his rifle, but Ayanna's hand touched his arm. Softly, she shook her head. Then she stepped forward, past the barrel, past his reach. She faced the men alone. "I know harm," she said slowly, her accent heavy but her voice clear. "I care for child. I work. I know fight." Her words hung in the cold night air. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing both fear and defiance. Earl sneered. "You don't belong here." Ayanna lifted her chin. "I belong where love live." Even the horses went still. Earl hesitated, the kind of hesitation that comes when a man realizes his hatred makes him smaller, not stronger. But pride is louder than conscience. He threw his torch to the ground, where it hissed and smoked against the frost. "Let's go," he muttered finally. "Ain't worth hanging for." The others followed, grumbling, the sound of their hooves fading into the dark. Thomas stood frozen, breath clouding the air, heart pounding. When the silence returned, he looked at her, really looked at her. "You shouldn't have done that," he said softly. She smiled faintly, eyes shining with tears. "No fear now." For the first time since Mary's death, Thomas felt something deep and shaking. Not love exactly, but faith. Faith in another human being. That night, after the fires had died and the stars had returned, Thomas sat outside, the rifle across his knees. The wind carried the scent of smoke and pine. Ayanna came and stood beside him, wrapped in a shawl. Neither spoke. The silence between them felt full, not empty. He looked at her, his voice rough. "I don't know what to say." She touched her heart, then the sky, then his hand, a gesture that seemed to mean, the heart knows, even when words don't. Thomas swallowed hard. "You saved us tonight." She shook her head. "No, you save you." Then softer, "You good man." He almost laughed, a broken, breathless sound. Not sure about that. Ayana looked toward the horizon. Good man, see people, not color. The word struck him deep, deeper than any bullet could have. He turned his gaze to the stars. They glittered cold and bright above them, like the eyes of God himself, bearing witness to something fragile and holy. The next morning, the ranch was quiet again. Annie ran through the yard, laughter spilling like sunlight over frost. Ayana hung laundry in the wind, the fabric snapping like sails of a small ship bound for gentler seas. Thomas stood by the fence, watching them. Something loosened inside him, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. The narrator's voice falls soft, like dust settling after storm. Sometimes redemption doesn't roar. It comes in the sound of laughter returning to a house that forgot how to echo. He walked toward them, took the basket from Ayana's hands. Their fingers brushed, just lightly, and both paused, startled by the warmth. Annie looked up at him, smiling. "Papa, can she stay forever?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded once. "She's family now." The child clapped her hands in joy. Ayana lowered her eyes, whispering something that sounded like prayer, not to gods, but to the wind itself. The narrator lingers on the closing image. The ranch beneath the vast blue sky. Smoke curling from the chimney. A man learning mercy. A woman learning safety. A child learning that love can rebuild what hate destroyed. The fire beneath the sky had not burned them to ash. It had refined them, leaving behind something rare and pure and enduring. Sometimes, the storyteller whispers, the world catches fire just to remind us what's worth saving. The winter passed like an old soldier, weary, limping, but unwilling to fall. When spring finally came, it came quietly. Snow melted into streams that sang down the hills. The earth woke in small whispers, buds breaking through the thaw, grass shyly greening again. The valley, once bitter with gossip and frost, softened. Men still spoke Thomas Weller's name, but no longer with fire. The world, even the small cruel part of it that called itself a town, had found a new scandal to chew on. And so, for the first time in a long time, peace truly took root. Thomas rebuilt the barn that winter fire had scorched. Ayana planted herbs near the porch, things she said keep sickness far away. Annie grew taller, stronger, her laughter ringing like church bells in the open air. The house began to look lived in again. There were clothes drying on the line, books left open on the table, the smell of bread baking on Sunday mornings. And sometimes, if you stood outside at dusk, you could hear two voices singing softly, one low and steady, the other lilting like wind through reeds. They were building something wordless together. Not romance exactly, but something the world could never quite name. A kind of family born not from blood, but from survival. One evening, as the sun folded itself behind the hills, Thomas and Ayana sat by the fire. The light painted her face gold. His was half in shadow. He said quietly, "You ever think of leaving? Going back east? Or to your people?" Ayana's eyes flicked toward the horizon. "No east for me. He's gone. My people." She hesitated, her hand curling around her necklace, a small carved bone tied with faded string. "My people whine now. They travel in sky." Thomas nodded, understanding more than words could hold. He poked at the fire, watching sparks lift and vanish. "I guess we both lost what we were," he said softly. Ayana looked at him for a long time. Then, no lose. Change. She pointed at the fire. When would burn, it no die. It become light. Warm. He met her gaze. "And when the fire's gone?" She smiled faintly. "Ash feed ground. New grow." Thomas turned back to the flames, his throat tight. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Weeks passed, and the world turned green again. Then one day a letter came, stamped with the seal of the government, edges crisp as law. Thomas read it 3 times before setting it down. They wanted to buy his land, the railroad company. They'd pay well, they said. But if he refused, they'd take it anyway. Progress, they called it. Steel rails through the valley. Smoke and iron cutting across the horizon. He looked out at the pasture, the horses grazing, the hills that had been his whole life. He looked at Ayana, who was hanging clothes in the wind, Annie chasing chickens at her feet. Progress. He folded the letter and slipped it into the fire. The edges curled, blackened, turned to nothing. Some things were worth more than the world's idea of forward. That night, he told Ayanna. She listened quietly, eyes steady. Then she said, "When wind too strong, tree bend. If not bend, break." He frowned. "You saying I should sell?" She shook her head. "I say, listen to heart, not paper." Thomas sighed, staring into the distance. He could hear the river, swollen with spring melt, wild and alive. It reminded him of her somehow, untamable, honest, eternal. "I just want to keep what's ours," he said. She reached out, her hand brushing his. "Home, not land. Home is where fires stay." He didn't understand it then, not fully. But the words would return later when he needed them most. Days later, the storm came. The kind that turned sky to bruise and earth to mud. Lightning tore through the clouds, thunder cracking like rifle fire. Thomas had gone to town early that day to buy feed and fix the roof before worse weather came. Ayanna stayed with Annie, tending the animals. By noon, the wind howled like a wounded beast. By dusk, the river had burst its banks. The water came fast, a wall of it, churning, black with earth and branches. Ayanna grabbed the child, clutching her close as the barn door shuddered. The horses screamed. The chickens were already gone. She tried to reach the house, but the path was gone, swallowed by water and mud. "Annie!" she shouted over the roar. "Hold tight." The girl clung to her, terrified. The cold bit deep. Rain lashed like whips. Then, a sound like the world tearing open. The barn roof cracked, timbers splitting. Ayanna didn't think. She just moved. She shoved the girl toward the loft ladder, lifting her up. "Go! Go, little one!" Annie climbed, crying, her small hands slipping on the rungs. Ayanna pushed her up, shouting words she didn't even know she knew, half in English, half in prayer. The next crash came, the wall caving in. The water surged through, lifting Ayanna off her feet. "Papa!" the girl screamed from above. Thomas was already on the road, galloping hard, the rain blinding, the horse wild beneath him. He saw the flood before he saw the barn. Water swallowing fences, trees torn from roots. "God Almighty!" he whispered, spurring faster. When he reached the yard, it was chaos. The barn half gone, the river roaring like Judgment Day. He saw the child clinging to the rafters, and below her, Ayanna, waist-deep in water, fighting to stay upright. "Annie," he shouted. "Jump!" The girl sobbed. "I can't." He threw himself into the current, the cold stealing his breath. Ayanna saw him coming, saw the determination, the fear, the love, and in that instant, she knew what she had to do. She lifted the child higher onto the last dry beam. "Hold tight," she cried, her voice fierce, alive. Then she turned and let the current take her. Thomas reached her just as she was pulled under. He caught her arm, fingers slick, desperate, but the water tore between them like a blade. "Ayanna!" Her face vanished beneath the flood. By dawn, the storm had passed. The valley lay broken, fences gone, trees uprooted, the land carved with new scars. Thomas found her half a mile downriver, tangled in reeds, still and pale as moonlight. He felt his knees beside her, choking on a sound that wasn't quite a cry. For hours he stayed there, until the sky turned gold again. He covered her with his coat, his hand resting on hers, whispering words the wind carried away. When he finally stood, he carried her home, not as burden, but as vow. They buried her under the old cottonwood tree, the one that grew by the river she had loved. Annie placed her necklace, the small carved bone, into the soil. Thomas said no prayer. The land itself did that. He built a small stone marker. No name, no date, just a carved flame. Weeks passed. The river quieted. The valley healed. But the house was not empty. Every morning, when the wind moved through the curtains, it carried her hum, faint, familiar. Annie grew older, and Thomas gentler. He spoke less, smiled more. The fire in him no longer burned to destroy. It burned to remember. And sometimes, on calm nights, he would sit by the river and whisper her words to the sky. Home is where fires stay. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would stop by the Weller place. They'd find an old man and a young woman, his daughter now grown, tending to horses, the fields alive again. And they'd see the cottonwood by the river, tall and golden, with wildflowers blooming at its roots even in winter. Locals said the land never flooded again. They said the woman buried there still watched over it, the fire that stayed beneath the soil, the light that never went out. The storyteller's voice softens to a whisper now, the final ember glowing in the ashes. Love does not always survive the storm, but sometimes it becomes the ground the next spring grows from. The fire that stayed was not in the hearth, nor in the sky. It was in them, and it is in us still.